Elena's fingers traced the worn cedar railing of her porch as Marcus emerged from his BMW, his Italian leather shoes immediately sinking into the soft earth that never fully dried in these depths of the peninsula. 8 months ago, she might have rushed to steady him, might have apologized for the inconvenience of her chosen sanctuary. Now, watching him curse under his breath as moss-dark mud stained his $1,000 footwear, she felt only a distant sort of pity. Christ, Elena, how do you live like this? Marcus's voice carried the same dismissive tone that had once made her question everything about herself. He gestured broadly at her cabin, at the herb gardens that spilled in wild abundance around the clearing, at the wind chimes made from driftwood and deer antler that sang their quiet songs in the mountain breeze. I live quite well, actually. Her voice was steadier than she'd expected, rooted in the same deep certainty that had guided her through the past 8 months of solitude. The child within her womb shifted, as if responding to the tension in her body, and she placed both hands protectively over the swell of her belly. Marcus's gaze fixed on her pregnancy with a mixture of relief and revulsion that made her skin crawl. Thank God I got out when I did. Can you imagine what the partners would have said? A pregnant woman living like some kind of wilderness witch. The words should have stung. Once, they would have sent her spiraling into the self-doubt that had plagued her through their entire relationship. Instead, Elena found herself listening to the forest around them, the whisper of old-growth branches overhead, the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, the almost musical drip of moisture from fern fronds heavy with perpetual mist. This place had taught her to hear truth beneath the noise of human cruelty. You didn't drive 4 hours to insult me, Marcus. What do you want? He reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, crisp and legal and utterly out of place among the living green chaos of her garden. Final papers. Sign them, and you can play forest hermit all you want. My lawyers have made it very clear that I have no financial responsibility for... He waved vaguely at her belly again, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the life growing there. Elena accepted the envelope but didn't open it. The paper felt cold against her fingers, sterile in a way that seemed almost offensive here, where everything pulsed with life and growth and ancient wisdom. You could have mailed these. I wanted to see for myself how far you'd fallen. Marcus's smile was sharp, calculated to wound. My mother was right about you from the beginning. Too wild, too strange. Not the kind of woman who could handle the responsibilities of my world. A year ago, those words would have been daggers finding their mark in every insecurity she'd carried since childhood. The girl who talked to animals, who could coax medicine from plants with just a touch, who had always felt like she belonged nowhere in the civilized world. But the woman she'd become in these mountains, the woman who had learned to trust her own strength, simply nodded. Your world, she repeated softly. Glass towers and networking events and wives who smile pretty while their souls die a little more each day. You're right, Marcus. I couldn't handle that. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at finding her so unmoved by his cruelty. Look at yourself, Elena, 8 months pregnant, alone in the middle of nowhere. When that baby comes, what then? You can't deliver it yourself. I'm not alone. The words came without thought, surprising them both. Elena blinked, uncertain where the certainty had come from. In practical terms, she was very much alone. Her nearest neighbor was Mrs. Chen, 15 miles down the mountain road, and the midwife from Port Angeles made monthly visits but wouldn't return for 2 weeks. Yet as she stood there facing Marcus's scorn, she could feel something else in the forest around them, a presence, watchful and patient, that had grown stronger over the months since her arrival. She'd glimpsed it sometimes at the edge of her vision, a figure moving between the massive trunks of ancient cedars, too large and fluid to be entirely human. The ravens spoke of him in their harsh whispers, and the deer grew calm when he passed through their feeding grounds. Marcus followed her gaze toward the tree line, seeing nothing but shadow and green abundance. Alone, he repeated with satisfaction. Exactly as you deserve to be. The baby kicked then, hard enough to steal Elena's breath, and she pressed her hand to the spot where tiny feet pushed against her ribs. The movement was fierce, protective, as if the child shared her sudden surge of anger at this man who had once convinced her she was less than worthy. "Leave," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Sign your papers or don't sign them. I don't care anymore, but get off my land." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, to deliver whatever final cruelty he'd prepared, but something in her expression stopped him. For the first time since his arrival, uncertainty flickered across his features. In the ancient silence of the forest, something much larger than either of them was stirring. Marcus retreated to his BMW with less dignity than he'd arrived, his expensive shoes squelching through the mud as he muttered something about lawyers and final deadlines. Elena remained on her porch until the sound of his engine faded completely, swallowed by the vast green silence of the peninsular forest. Only then did she allow herself to sink into the cedar chair she'd built with her own hands, her knees suddenly unsteady. The envelope lay forgotten in her lap as she pressed both palms against her belly, feeling the child settle into a calmer rhythm. "It's all right, little one," she whispered. "He's gone now." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, doubt crept in like morning mist. Marcus had been cruel, yes, but he'd also touched on the very fears that woke her at 3 in the morning when the baby's movements grew restless. She was 8 months pregnant, 47 miles from the nearest hospital, with no family and few friends. The midwife, Sarah, was competent and kind, but Elena's grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Childbirth is when women discover how truly alone they are in the world. She forced herself to stand, to move through the familiar routines that had sustained her through 8 months of solitude. First, the herb gardens that surrounded her cabin like protective guardians. The late summer harvest was nearly complete. Mason jars lined her kitchen shelves with dried calendula, echinacea, red clover, and dozens of other healing plants that grew with unusual abundance in this microclimate between the mountains and the sea. As she deadheaded the last of the chamomile flowers, she noticed something that made her pause. The deer had been grazing here again, but instead of the usual scattered damage, they'd been selective, almost careful. They'd taken only what they needed, leaving the rest untouched. It was unusual behavior for wild deer, as if something had taught them restraint. The sensation of being watched intensified as she worked. Not the uncomfortable scrutiny she'd endured under Marcus's gaze, but something protective, patient. She'd felt it growing stronger over the months, particularly in the evenings when she sat on her porch with her herbal tea, watching the mist rise from the valley below. Sometimes she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, a figure too tall and broad to be entirely human, moving with impossible silence through the undergrowth. Mrs. Chen had mentioned him during one of her infrequent visits, calling him simply the Woodsman, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd lived on the peninsula her entire life. "He's always been here," she'd said, arranging the preserves she'd brought as an offering of neighborhood kindness. "My grandmother spoke of him, and her grandmother before that. The forest folk say he tends to those who need tending." Elena had dismissed it as local folklore then, charming but irrelevant to her practical concerns. Now, feeling that steady presence in the trees around her clearing, she wondered if Mrs. Chen's words held more truth than poetry. Inside the cabin, she moved through the afternoon rituals that had become her anchor. Tea first, red raspberry leaf for the pregnancy, nettle for iron, a touch of rose hips for the coming autumn chill. The cast-iron pot her grandmother had left her seemed to hold heat longer here, as if the mountain air concentrated its warmth. Her hands moved automatically to the baby blanket she'd been knitting, soft grey wool the colour of morning mist. Each stitch was a meditation, a prayer, a small act of faith that she would indeed hold this child safely in her arms. But Marcus's words echoed, "When that baby comes, what then?" She'd prepared as much as any first-time mother could. The birth kit sat ready in her bedroom. Clean towels, sterilized scissors, emergency supplies Sarah had helped her assemble. She'd read every book, practiced every breathing technique, memorized the warning signs that would require the desperate drive to Port Angeles. But knowledge couldn't fill the hollow ache of having no one to call when labor started, no hand to hold through the long hours of birth, no voice to whisper encouragement when her strength failed. The child's father had made his position brutally clear today. She was alone by choice, and alone she would remain. As evening approached, Elena settled into her porch chair with her tea and knitting, following a routine that had become sacred. The forest awakened around her in subtle ways, the rustle of small creatures beginning their nocturnal hunts, the distant call of an owl, the almost inaudible whisper of ancient trees settling into darkness. That's when she felt it most clearly, the presence that watched over her clearing with patient devotion. Tonight, perhaps emboldened by Marcus's intrusion, it seemed closer than ever. She found herself speaking to the darkness between the cedar trunks, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you're there. I don't know what you are, but I know you're listening." Her hands stilled on the knitting needles. "I'm trying to be brave, but I'm scared, not of you, never of you, but of doing this alone." The forest held its breath, and Elena could swear she felt something vast and gentle, focusing its attention entirely on her words. In the ancient silence, her deepest truth finally found voice. "I don't want to be alone anymore." The words hung in the evening air like a prayer offered to ancient gods, and for a heartbeat, the entire forest seemed to pause in reverence. Even the wind stilled, leaving only the soft patter of moisture dripping from cedar boughs heavy with perpetual mist. Then the silence shattered. A sound like thunder rolled through the clearing, not from the sky but from deep within the earth itself. The ground beneath Elena's feet trembled, sending ripples through her teacup and causing the wind chimes to sing in frantic, discordant harmony. She gripped the arms of her chair as the baby responded to her sudden tension, rolling and kicking with unusual urgency. The tremor lasted only seconds, but in its wake came something far more unsettling: absolute stillness. No owl called from the darkness, no small creatures rustled through the underbrush. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the canopy had ceased, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Elena rose slowly from her chair, one hand pressed to her belly, the other clutching her tea mug like an anchor to normalcy. What? Light blazed between the cedar trunks. Not the warm yellow glow of electric bulbs or the dancing orange of flames, but something altogether otherworldly, silver-white radiance that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. It moved through the forest with purpose, growing brighter as it approached her clearing, and with it came a sound she felt more than heard, footsteps that resonated through the ground like distant drum beats. Elena's rational mind catalogued possibilities. Earthquake, though she'd felt nothing like the described jolts of tectonic activity; lightning, though the sky remained clear above the canopy; equipment failure at the hydroelectric plant 20 miles north, though that wouldn't explain the approaching light or the way every wild creature had fallen silent. But her deeper instincts, the part of her that had always been able to sense the hidden currents beneath the visible world, whispered a different truth. He's coming. The light reached the edge of her clearing and stopped. Elena could make out a silhouette now, massive shoulders, towering height, the suggestion of a man but scaled beyond human proportions. The radiance seemed to emanate not from any source he carried, but from his very presence, as if starlight had taken human form and walked out of the ancient stories her grandmother used to tell. Elena. Her name spoken in a voice like distant thunder, gentle despite its power. The sound traveled through her bones, resonating in the same frequency as her heartbeat, and the baby within her womb grew still, as if listening. She should have been terrified. Every survival instinct should have sent her running for the cabin, for the phone, for the rifle she kept mounted above her fireplace. Instead, she found herself taking a step forward, then another, drawn by recognition she couldn't name. "I felt your call," the figure said, and now she could see him more clearly. Taller than seemed possible, with shoulders that could have been hewn from the mountain stone itself. His hair was dark as midnight water, his skin bronzed by countless seasons under the forest canopy. But it was his eyes that stole her breath, ancient blue-green depths that held the wisdom of centuries and a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. "I don't understand." Elena's voice came out smaller than intended, but steady. The baby shifted restlessly, and she pressed her palm flat against her belly. "Who are you?" "I am Ronan Mac Leod." He stepped fully into her clearing, and the light around him dimmed to a softer glow, less overwhelming but no less otherworldly. "I've been watching over this place for longer than these trees have grown, watching over you since the day you first spoke to the ravens." Memory flooded back, her second week in the cabin, when loneliness had driven her to sit by the creek and pour out her fears to a parliament of ravens. She'd felt foolish afterward, talking to birds like some fairy tale character, but the ravens had listened with an attention that seemed almost human. "That's impossible." Even as she said it, Elena knew she was clinging to a rationality that had already been shattered. The evidence stood before her, 7 feet of impossibility, radiating power that made her skin tingle and her heart race. You can't be human." Ronan's smile was gentle, tinged with an old sadness. "No, lass, I haven't been human for 300 years. The world tilted around her, and Elena sank onto her porch steps, the tea mug forgotten in her hands. 300 years. The peninsula had been virgin wilderness then, home only to indigenous peoples who spoke of spirits in the cedar groves, before loggers, before settlers, before the modern world had carved its harsh edges into this ancient land. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ronan moved closer, his massive frame somehow graceful despite its size. When he spoke, his voice held the weight of centuries and the tenderness of spring rain. "Because you asked not to be alone anymore, and I've been alone far longer than you can imagine." The choice hung between them like mist, shimmering with possibility and terror in equal measure. Elena stared at the impossible figure before her, her rational mind fragmenting like morning frost under sunlight. The tea mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the porch steps in a cascade of ceramic and chamomile-scented liquid. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held her suspended between worlds. "No." She pushed herself upright, backing toward her cabin door with unsteady steps. "This isn't real. You're not real. I'm 8 months pregnant and isolated, and my mind is—" "Your mind is perfectly sound," Ronan said gently. But he stopped advancing, his massive frame going still as carved stone. "Though I understand why you'd prefer madness to truth. It would be easier, wouldn't it?" The baby kicked violently, as if responding to her distress, and Elena gasped, one hand flying to her belly. Pain lanced through her lower back, the familiar ache that had been growing stronger these past weeks. She couldn't do this, couldn't stand here having an impossible conversation with a creature from folklore while her body prepared for the most vulnerable moment of her life. "Stay back," she whispered, though he hadn't moved. "Whatever you are, whatever you want—" "I want nothing from you, lass." His voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "I offer only what you asked for, an end to loneliness." "By lying to me?" Elena's laugh cracked around the edges. "By appearing when I'm at my most vulnerable and spinning fairy tales about curses and centuries? What kind of sick—" "Look at me." The command was soft but irrefutable, carrying the authority of wind through old growth cedars. "Truly look, Elena. You've always seen what others couldn't. Your grandmother's gift runs true in your blood." Against every instinct screaming for her to run, Elena found herself studying his face in the ethereal light that clung to his skin. The bone structure was too perfect, too symmetrical, as if carved by a master sculptor. His eyes held depths that spoke of watching seasons turn into decades, decades into centuries. And there, just there, at the corners of those ancient eyes, she saw the same bone-deep exhaustion she recognized in her own mirror. "The deer," she breathed suddenly. "They've been grazing differently, more carefully. That was you." I And the ravens who bring you bright stones for your garden, the creek that hasn't run dry despite the drought, the wolves that hunt elsewhere, though your clearing sits perfectly in their territory. Each revelation fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew. I've been watching over you as I've watched over all who come to these mountains with pure hearts. Elena pressed both hands to her belly as another wave of discomfort rolled through her. The baby had grown restless, movements sharp and urgent. You're asking me to believe in magic, in curses, she gestured helplessly at his towering form, in whatever you are. I'm asking you to trust what your heart already knows. Ronan's expression grew achingly tender. You came here because the wild called to you, because these mountains promise sanctuary your civilized world never could. That same instinct that brought you to this place, what does it tell you now? Terror, that's what it told her. Not of him, she realized with startling clarity, but of what accepting his truth would mean. If magic existed, if he existed, then everything she'd built her new life upon, her careful solitude, her determination to need no one, her certainty that she could raise this child alone, crumbled into dust. I can't, she whispered, tears burning behind her eyes. I can't let myself believe in fairy tales, not now. I have to be strong, practical. I have a baby coming and no one to... Her voice broke on the admission she'd been fighting for months. No one to help me, no one to catch me if I fall. You wouldn't be falling, lass. You'd be flying. The gentleness in his voice nearly undid her. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling simultaneously too large and too small for her own skin. You don't understand. I've been abandoned before. By my parents when they couldn't handle a daughter who was too strange. By Marcus when I became inconvenient. I can't, I won't, survive being abandoned again. Who says anything about abandoning you? Everyone leaves eventually. The words tasted bitter as old herbs. Everyone realizes I'm too much work, too weird, too wild for the real world. Why would you be different? Why would some magical guardian want to saddle himself with a pregnant woman and her complicated life? Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of understanding that made her chest tight. When he spoke, his voice carried the whisper of wind through eternal forests. Perhaps because this guardian has spent 3 centuries learning that the rarest treasures are always wild, always complicated, always worth whatever price the universe demands. The choice still hung between them, but now Elena could see her own reflection in his eyes, afraid, fierce, and achingly alone despite his offered presence. Elena stood frozen on her porch steps, caught between the rational world that had always disappointed her and something that defied every law of nature she'd accepted. The ethereal light surrounding Ronan pulsed gently, matching the rhythm of her racing heart, and she realized with crystal clarity that this moment would divide her life into before and after. 3 centuries, she whispered, the words falling like stones into deep water. You've been alone for 3 centuries. I. His voice carried the weight of endless seasons, of watching the world change while remaining unchanged himself. Bound to these mountains by an oath I made in grief and desperation, protecting those who needed protection, healing what could be healed, but never... He paused, something raw flickering across his ancient features, never truly belonging to any world, too human for the forest spirits, too other for mortal folk. The baby shifted within her, a gentle roll that felt almost like encouragement. Elena's hand moved instinctively to the spot, and she watched Ronan's eyes track the movement with wonder so pure it made her breath catch. What are you? The question came out softer than intended, no longer an accusation but genuine curiosity. A guardian, a healer, a man who made a bargain with forces older than human memory to save someone he loved. His massive shoulders carried the weight of old grief, though I failed in that as well. Something in his tone, the carefully controlled pain, resonated through Elena's bones. She recognized the particular ache of loving someone beyond saving, of carrying guilt that no logic could diminish. Who did you lose? My daughter. The words fell into the clearing like shed blood, sacred and terrible. Fever took her in the crossing to the new world. I was clan healer, but all my knowledge, all my skill, useless against the sickness that swept through the ship. I would have traded my soul to save her. And someone took that bargain. The old spirits of this place. They offered me power to heal others as I couldn't heal her, but at a price. To remain bound to these mountains until... He trailed off, something vulnerable flickering across his features. Until what? Until I found the one soul meant to free me. His eyes met hers, and Elena felt the earth shift beneath her feet in ways that had nothing to do with magic. The one whose heart could choose love over fear, wild over safe, magic over the mundane world's cruel certainties. The words hung between them, loaded with implications that made Elena's chest tight. She thought of Marcus's parting shots, his certainty that she was unwanted, unworthy, too strange for any rational person to claim. Yet here stood someone, something, who looked at her fierce independence and saw treasure instead of burden. Another wave of discomfort rolled through her belly, stronger this time, and she gripped the porch railing. The baby was growing restless, movements urgent and insistent, as if responding to the charged atmosphere surrounding this impossible conversation. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words torn from some deep place she'd kept locked away. "Not of you, of this, of believing and being wrong, of trusting and being abandoned when the reality of my life becomes too much." Ronan took a careful step closer, his movement fluid despite his massive size. "What if I told you that your life, all of it, the strangeness that made others turn away, the wildness that couldn't be tamed, what if that's exactly what I've been waiting centuries to find?" "I'd say you don't know what you're asking for." Elena's laugh held no humor. "I come with complications, a baby with no father, a history of disappointing people who wanted me to be smaller, quieter, more acceptable. A gift for seeing things that aren't supposed to exist, like me. Like you." She met his gaze directly, fear and longing warring in her chest. "If I accept this, accept you, there's no going back, is there? No pretending the world is ordinary and safe." "No," he said gently. "But was it ever truly safe for you? Was ordinary ever truly an option for someone who speaks to ravens and makes plants grow with uncommon vigor?" The truth of his words hit like a physical blow. She'd spent years trying to fit into Marcus's world, trying to make herself acceptable to parents who saw her gifts as embarrassment, trying to convince herself that normal was achievable if she just tried hard enough. But the wild had always called to her, and she'd always answered, even when it meant disappointing everyone around her. "The baby," she said suddenly, panic fluttering in her throat. "If I choose this path, what happens to my child?" Ronan's expression grew impossibly tender. "Your child was conceived under a blood moon, lass, born of a mother who carries old magic in her blood and grows herbs with supernatural abundance. This little one was always going to be extraordinary." Elena pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the strong movements within. In that moment, standing between the mundane world that had never wanted her and the impossible promise of belonging, she made the choice that would transform everything. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me what it means to not be alone." Ronan's smile transformed his face, centuries of solitude lifting like mist before dawn. He extended one massive hand toward her, palm up, and Elena saw that his skin held the same ethereal glow that surrounded him. Not harsh or blinding, but warm as candlelight. "May the first?" he asked, and she realized he was asking permission to touch her belly, to greet the child she carried. Elena's breath caught. No one had asked to touch her pregnancy with such reverence, such careful respect. Marcus had treated her growing belly like an inconvenience, her parents like an embarrassment. But Ronan looked at her as if she carried something sacred. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. His palm settled against her belly with infinite gentleness, and immediately the baby's restless movements calmed. Elena felt warmth spread through her entire body, not heat, but something deeper, like coming inside from a winter storm to find a perfect fire waiting. "Hello, little one," Ronan murmured, his voice pitched low and soft. "I've been waiting to meet you." The baby responded with a gentle roll, pressing toward his touch, and Elena gasped. In 8 months of pregnancy, she'd never felt her child react so peacefully to anyone's presence. "They know you," she whispered. "Children always recognize magic more clearly than adults. Your little one has been listening to the forest's heartbeat through yours." His thumb traced a gentle arc across her belly, strong, healthy, and yes, extraordinary. A new voice cut through the tender moment like a blade. "Well, well. Isn't this touching?" Elena spun toward the tree line, her heart slamming against her ribs. A woman emerged from the shadows between the cedars, tall, elegant, with silver hair that seemed to move in a wind Elena couldn't feel. Her clothes were designer expensive, but somehow timeless, as if fashion bent to her will rather than the other way around. Ronan's entire demeanor shifted, his warmth replaced by deadly alertness. "Morgaine." "Hello, brother." The woman's smile was sharp as winter ice. "Still playing protector to lost humans, I see. You have no business here." Ronan moved slightly, placing himself between Elena and the newcomer. "The bargain was mine alone." "Ah, but bargains have consequences, don't they?" Morgaine's gaze fixed on Elena with predatory interest, especially when they're about to be fulfilled. Elena pressed back against her cabin wall, instinctively cradling her belly. The baby had gone completely still, as if sensing danger. "Who is she?" "One of the old spirits who bound me here." Ronan's voice was carefully controlled, but Elena could see tension coiled in every line of his massive frame. "She believes in different methods of protecting these mountains." "I believe in preserving the old ways," Morgaine corrected smoothly. "Before humans came with their machines and their poison, cutting down trees that had stood since the world was young." Her attention returned to Elena. "Though I admit this one is different. Stay away from her." Morgaine laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Ronan, you think I'm here to harm your precious mortal? Quite the opposite. I'm here to offer her a choice." Another contraction gripped Elena, stronger than before, and she doubled over with a gasp. Both Ronan and Morgaine went still, their attention snapping to her with laser focus. "The child comes," Morgaine observed with satisfaction. "How perfectly timed. Labor under a blood moon with wild magic thick in the air. Your little one will be quite powerful indeed." "What choice?" Elena managed through gritted teeth as the contraction faded. "What are you talking about?" "The same choice Ronan faced centuries ago." Morgaine's smile turned predatory. "Your child will be born with gifts that will mark them as different, dangerous in the eyes of your human world. You can raise them among mortals who will fear what they don't understand. Watch them struggle as you have struggled, or you can give them to the forest. Let them grow wild and free, protected by powers older than human civilization. You want to take my baby?" The words came out flat, deadly calm. "I want to save your baby from the fate that awaits all magical children in your world. Mockery, isolation, eventual destruction of everything that makes them special." Elena straightened, and Ronan felt something shift in the air around them. Power hummed beneath her skin, answering the threat to her child with primal fury. "Over my dead body. That can be arranged," Morgaine replied pleasantly. The clearing exploded into motion. Ronan lunged forward, his form blazing with protective light. Morgaine raised one hand, silver fire crackling between her fingers. And Elena felt something ancient and fierce unfurl within her chest, magic she'd never known she possessed rushing through her veins like molten starlight. The baby kicked once, hard, and Elena realized with crystal clarity that the real test had just begun. The power that erupted from Elena's core was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Wild, primal, and utterly protective. It surged through her bloodstream like liquid lightning, and suddenly the clearing blazed with golden light that poured from her skin in waves. Morgane stumbled backward, her silver fire sputtering against Elena's unexpected radiance. "Impossible," she hissed. "No untrained mortal could—" "She's not untrained." Ronan's voice carried deadly certainty as he straightened from his protective crouch. "She's awakening, just as the prophecy foretold." Elena barely heard their exchange over the roaring in her ears. The magic filling her felt like coming home to a part of herself she'd never known existed, fierce, maternal, absolutely unwilling to bend. Another contraction gripped her, but instead of weakness, it brought fresh waves of power that made the very air shimmer. "Prophecy?" She gritted the word through clenched teeth, her hands instinctively weaving patterns in the air that somehow felt as natural as breathing. Golden threads of light followed her movements, forming barriers between Morgane and her unborn child. "The forest spirits spoke of one who would come," Ronan explained, his own power rising to complement hers. "A woman carrying magic in her bloodline who would birth a child capable of bridging the world between mortal and fae, a child who could either heal the growing rift between realms or tear it apart completely." Morgane's beautiful face twisted with fury. "Which is precisely why the child must be raised properly, away from human corruption. You've seen what your world does to magical beings, Elena Blackwood. They study them, cage them, break them into pieces, trying to understand power they can never possess." The accusation hit closer to home than Elena wanted to admit. She thought of her childhood, the way her parents had dragged her to specialists when she started talking to animals, the medications they'd forced down her throat to stop her hallucinations, the way Marcus had tolerated her herb garden only as long as it remained a quaint hobby instead of the powerful craft it truly was. "I won't let that happen," Elena said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. How could she protect a magical child when she'd never learned to protect herself? Morgane sensed the weakness immediately. "Won't you? When the first teacher calls your child disturbed, when doctors want to medicate away their gifts, when other children's parents whisper about the strange family in the mountains." She moved closer, her form shifting subtly until she looked less like an ancient spirit and more like a concerned grandmother. "I offer sanctuary, a place where your child can learn their true nature without shame or fear." Elena felt her resolve waver. The vision Morgane painted was seductive, a world where being different meant being treasured instead of tolerated. But something deep in her maternal instincts recoiled from the offer. "At what cost?" she demanded. "What aren't you telling me?" Ronan's sharp intake of breath provided the answer before Morgane could speak. "Children given to the forest don't age as mortals do. They become something other than human, Elena. Beautiful, powerful, but no longer truly your child. They become what they were meant to be," Morgane countered. "Free from the limitations of mortal flesh, the cruelty of mortal judgment." Another contraction slammed through Elena, this one strong enough to drive her to her knees. The golden light around her pulsed erratically, and she felt the baby shift lower, preparing for birth. Fear clawed at her throat, not just of the pain, but of the impossible choice being demanded of her. "She's in labor," Ronan said sharply, moving to Elena's side. "Whatever games you're playing, Morgane, they end now." "Games?" Morgane's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "I'm trying to prevent a catastrophe. That child will be born with power beyond anything these mountains have seen in 1,000 years. If raised in the human world, they'll either be destroyed by it or destroy it in return." Elena gripped Ronan's hand as the contraction peaked, his warmth steadying her, even as chaos swirled around them. Through the haze of pain and power, one truth crystallized. Whatever her child was destined to become, it would happen with her guidance or not at all. "I need to get inside," she managed as the pain ebbed. "If this baby is coming tonight, I won't give birth in a battlefield." "The cabin won't protect you from what's coming," Morgane warned. "The moment that child draws breath, every magical creature within 100 miles will feel their presence. Some will come to protect, others to claim, and still others to eliminate the threat entirely." Elena struggled to her feet, Ronan's strong arms supporting her. The golden light around her had settled into a steady glow, and she realized with growing amazement that the magic wasn't leaving. It was becoming part of her, as permanent as breath. "Then we'd better prepare for war," she said, meeting Morgaine's ancient gaze with newly awakened power burning in her own. "Because no one, spirit, fae or otherwise, is taking my child from me." The battle for her baby's future was about to begin. Elena's declaration hung in the air like a battle cry, but before anyone could respond, the forest itself began to answer. The ancient cedars groaned and swayed despite the still night air, their branches creaking out warnings in voices only she could suddenly understand. "They come," the trees whispered. "Many come." "Get her inside," Ronan commanded, scooping Elena into his arms as another contraction doubled her over. The golden light radiating from her skin cast wild shadows across the clearing, making the very darkness seem alive and restless. But as they reached the cabin steps, Morgaine's voice stopped them cold. "It's too late for hiding." Elena twisted in Ronan's embrace to see shapes emerging from the tree line, dozens of them. Some moved with fluid grace that spoke of otherworldly origins, while others shambled forward with predatory hunger that made her blood freeze. Glowing eyes pierced the darkness like scattered stars, and the air filled with chittering, growling, singing voices that definitely weren't human. "What are they?" Elena gasped, though part of her already knew. The same deep magic now flowing through her veins recognized these creatures as kin. Distant, dangerous kin. "Everything Morgaine said would come," Ronan replied grimly, setting Elena on her feet, but keeping his arms protectively around her. "Forest spirits who felt your child's power awakening, fae who hunger for new magic to claim, and worse things that view any bridge between worlds as a threat to be eliminated." A creature that looked like a bear made of living shadow padded into the clearing, its eyes fixed hungrily on Elena's belly. Behind it came something that might have been beautiful once, a woman with flowers in her hair and bark for skin, but her smile revealed rows of thorns instead of teeth. Elena felt her newly awakened power surge in response to the threat, but with it came a terrifying realization: she had no idea how to control it. The golden light flickering around her body pulsed erratically, sometimes blazing bright enough to make the gathered creatures hiss and retreat, other times dimming to almost nothing. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, panic threading through her voice. "This magic, I can feel it, but I can't control it." "Then learn quickly," Morgaine said, though her tone had shifted from threatening to almost urgent. "Because they're not going to wait for you to figure it out." Another contraction hit Elena like a physical blow, stronger than any before it. She cried out, doubling over as pain and power crashed through her in equal measure. The golden light exploded outward, washing over the assembled creatures with enough force to send several stumbling backward. But it also seemed to drive others into a frenzy. The shadow bear roared and charged forward, only to slam into a barrier of silver fire that Morgaine conjured between it and Elena. The flower woman began to sing, her voice sweet and hypnotic, and Elena felt her will starting to waver despite herself. "Focus on me," Ronan commanded, his hands framing her face as he forced her to meet his ancient eyes. "The baby is coming whether we're ready or not. You need to center yourself. Find the calm at the heart of the storm." "How?" Elena could barely get the word out through another wave of pain. Around them, the supernatural creatures pressed closer, held back only by Ronan's blazing presence and Morgaine's defensive magic. But she could see the strain on both their faces. They wouldn't be able to maintain this standoff much longer. "The same way you've always survived," Ronan said softly, "by trusting your instincts, by refusing to be anything less than exactly what you are." His words cut through her panic like a blade. Elena remembered every time she'd been told to be smaller, quieter, more normal. Every time she'd tried to dim her own light to make others comfortable. Every time she'd apologized for gifts that were actually strengths. "I won't apologize anymore," she whispered, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. The chaotic magic swirling through her bloodstream suddenly snapped into focus, no longer wild lightning but controlled fire. I won't hide what I am, and I won't let anyone, human or otherwise, decide my child's fate. The golden light around her solidified into something that felt less like uncontrolled power and more like armor. Elena straightened, despite the labor pains racking her body, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had finally claimed their birthright. This is my mountain, my home, my child. She looked directly at the gathered creatures, and several actually took steps backward. You want to test yourselves against me? Then understand this. I am no longer the frightened woman who let others define her worth. I am a mother protecting her young, and I will burn down this entire forest before I let any of you harm what's mine. Thunder rumbled overhead despite the clear sky, and Elena realized with dawning wonder that the storm was answering her call. The storm Elena had called responded with terrifying enthusiasm. Lightning split the night sky in jagged purple veins, illuminating the clearing in stroboscopic flashes that made the gathered creatures look even more nightmarish. But as thunder crashed overhead, something went horribly wrong. Instead of driving the magical beings away, the raw display of power seemed to intoxicate them. The shadow bear threw back its massive head and roared in ecstasy. The flower woman's thorny smile widened, her bark skin rippling with renewed hunger, and from the deeper forest came answering calls, howls, shrieks, and sounds Elena had no names for, all announcing that more creatures were coming. "Elena, stop!" Ronan shouted over the chaos, but his voice seemed to reach her through a tunnel of pain and magic. Another contraction seized her, this one so intense that she dropped to her knees, and with it came a surge of uncontrolled power that split the ancient cedar behind her cabin, straight down the middle. The tree fell with a groan that sounded almost human, crashing across the roof of her home. Elena watched in horror as the place she'd built for her child, the sanctuary she'd prepared with such careful love, crumpled under tons of splintered wood. "My cabin!" she gasped, the words torn from her chest like a physical wound. Everything she owned, every preparation for the baby, the herbs she'd dried for healing, all of it buried under the cedar she'd accidentally destroyed. The storm above them intensified, feeding off her despair. "The power is too much for her," Morgaine observed with clinical detachment. "Untrained, in labor, emotional, she's going to level the entire mountainside." As if to prove her point, another wave of Elena's magic lashed out as the next contraction hit. This time it struck the cliff face behind them, sending a cascade of boulders tumbling toward the clearing. Creatures scattered, but Elena could see more emerging from the forest to replace them, drawn like moths to the beacon of chaotic power she'd become. "I can't control it," Elena sobbed, golden light pouring from her skin in wild spirals. "I'm making everything worse." Ronan reached for her, but his own protective magic sparked against hers, the clash sending both of them reeling. For the first time since she'd met him, Elena saw fear in his ancient eyes, not of the creatures surrounding them, but of her. "The baby's coming now," she panted, feeling her body begin the final stage of labor whether she was ready or not. "But I can't. There's nowhere safe." "There is one place," Morgaine interrupted, moving closer despite the dangerous energy crackling around Elena. "The heart of the forest. The sacred grove where the old magic runs deep enough to contain yours, where your child can be born safely, away from all this chaos." Elena wanted to refuse, wanted to spit defiance at the ancient spirit who'd started this nightmare. But another look at her destroyed cabin, at the creatures still pouring into the clearing, at the way her own power was turning everything she touched into a weapon, and she felt her resolve crumble. "The grove is neutral ground," Morgaine continued, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic cadence. "No creature can claim the child there, no magic can harm them. But Elena, once we enter that sacred space, certain protocols must be observed." "What protocols?" Ronan demanded, but Elena could barely hear him over the roaring in her ears. The baby was crowning. She could feel it with terrifying certainty. There was no time for debate, no time for careful consideration of consequences. "Help me," she whispered, reaching toward Morgaine with desperate hands. The ancient spirit's touch was cold as winter wind, but it stabilized the chaos swirling through Elena's body. "Please." Morgaine's smile was triumphant as she helped Elena to her feet. "Of course, child. Trust me." Too late, Elena saw Ronan's expression shift from fear to horror. Too late, she felt the binding magic that wrapped around her the moment she accepted Morgaine's help. Too late, she understood that the protocols of the sacred grove included ancient laws about debts and obligations and the price of supernatural assistance. "What have you done?" Ronan lunged toward them, but Morgaine raised her free hand and spoke a word in a language older than human civilization. The air between them crystallized into an impenetrable barrier. "What was necessary?" Morgaine replied as the world began to blur around Elena's vision. She felt herself being pulled through space, through the spaces between trees, toward whatever fate awaited in the forest's heart. "The child will be born safely. That's what matters now." Elena's last sight of the clearing was Ronan's anguished face pressed against Morgaine's barrier, his mouth moving in words she couldn't hear. Then the darkness of the deep forest swallowed them whole, and Elena realized with cold, creeping certainty that, in her desperation to save her child, she might have just delivered them both into an even worse trap. The sacred grove materialized around them, beautiful and terrible and utterly inescapable. The sacred grove that materialized around Elena defied every natural law she thought she understood. Ancient trees twisted skyward in impossible spirals, their bark gleaming like polished silver under a canopy that held its own luminescent stars. Flowers that had no earthly names carpeted the ground in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the air itself seemed thick with concentrated magic that made her skin tingle and her newly awakened power hum in recognition. But it was the silence that struck her first. Absolute, profound silence that pressed against her eardrums like a physical weight. The storm she'd called, the creature sounds, even her own labored breathing seemed muffled, as if the grove existed in a pocket outside normal reality. "Where are we?" Elena gasped, another contraction seizing her, despite the otherworldly beauty surrounding them. Morgaine guided her toward what looked like an altar carved from a single massive tree stump, its surface worn smooth by countless ceremonies. "The heart of the forest," Morgaine replied, her ancient voice the only sound that seemed to carry properly in this space. "The first grove, planted when magic was young and the barriers between worlds were gossamer thin. Here, your child can be born as they were meant to be, touched by pure magic, unmarked by mortal limitations." Elena's legs gave out as the strongest contraction yet crashed through her, but instead of hitting the ground, she found herself supported by the grove itself. Vines rose from the earth to cushion her, flowers turned their faces toward her like living lamps, and the very air seemed to cradle her with gentle hands. But as the magical assistance surrounded her, Elena felt something else, a subtle wrongness that made her maternal instincts scream warnings. The grove was too perfect, too eager to help. The magic flowing around her felt hungry in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the creatures they'd fled. "What are the protocols you mentioned?" she demanded through gritted teeth, even as her body prepared for the final stage of labor. "What price comes with this sanctuary?" Morgaine's smile was gentle, maternal, and absolutely terrifying. "Nothing you wouldn't give willingly, dear child. The grove simply asks for what any sacred space requires: proper respect, acknowledgement of its power, and a small offering." "What kind of offering?" Elena's voice cracked as another wave of pain and pressure indicated her baby was coming, whether she had answers or not. "A single drop of the child's blood, given freely when they draw their first breath," Morgaine said, her tone suggesting this was a trivial request. "Just enough to awaken their true potential, to ensure they can access the full scope of their inherited magic." Elena's blood turned to ice despite the warmth surrounding her. Every fairy tale her grandmother had ever told her, Every warning about deals with supernatural beings, every instinct that had kept her ancestors alive in these mystical mountains, suddenly screamed in perfect unison. "Blood magic," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with horrible clarity. "You want to bind my child to this place, to you." "I want to give them the gift of their birthright," Morgane corrected, but her beautiful mask was finally starting to slip. Behind the concerned grandmother facade, Elena caught glimpses of something vast, ancient, and utterly alien. "The human world will destroy them, Elena. You've seen what it did to you. Years of medication, of being told your gifts were illness, of hiding your true nature. Would you condemn your child to the same fate?" The words hit their target with surgical precision because they carried the weight of truth. Elena remembered every doctor's appointment, every concerned teacher conference, every time she'd swallowed pills that made the world grey and lifeless just to stop the whispers about her strangeness. But as another contraction seized her, as she felt her child fighting to enter this world, Elena suddenly understood something that Morgane had missed. The pain, the struggle, the years of being misunderstood, they hadn't broken her. They'd forged her into someone strong enough to stand in a sacred grove and refuse an ancient spirit's bargain. "You're right," Elena said, her voice growing stronger even as her body strained with the effort of birth. "The human world tried to destroy me, but it failed. And you know why?" Morgane's perfect composure cracked just slightly. "Why?" "Because I was never alone." Elena gripped the sides of the tree stump altar as she felt her baby crown, power flooding through her with each breath. "I had people who loved me exactly as I was, a grandmother who taught me plant magic in secret, friends who accepted my strangeness, and now—" She met Morgane's ancient gaze with eyes that blazed like golden fire. "Now I have Ronan, who chose to love a wild thing, who values my strength instead of trying to tame it." The revelation hit her like lightning, not the chaotic storm magic she'd called before, but pure, focused understanding. This wasn't about choosing between the magical and mortal worlds. It was about refusing to let anyone else, human or fae, define what she and her child could become. "I don't need your grove," Elena declared as her baby's head emerged. "I am the sanctuary my child needs." Power exploded outward from her words, and the sacred grove began to crack. The ancient grove shuddered as Elena's declaration rippled through its foundations. Cracks of golden light split the silver bark of the impossible trees, and the luminescent flowers began to wither at their edges. Morgane stumbled backward, her beautiful mask finally crumbling to reveal something far older and more desperate than Elena had imagined. "You don't understand," the ancient spirit hissed, her voice no longer melodious but sharp as breaking ice. "Without proper binding, your child will be hunted by every creature that felt their awakening. The protection of the grove is the only thing standing between them and—" "And nothing," Elena interrupted, her body bearing down with the final push as her daughter fought to be born. "I choose the danger of freedom over the safety of chains." With those words, her baby slipped into the world, not onto the cold stone altar Morgane had prepared, but into Elena's own hands as she crouched among the cracking flowers. The moment her daughter drew her first breath, the grove's artificial perfection shattered completely. The silver trees revealed themselves as twisted thorns. The star-filled canopy became a prison of woven branches. The beautiful flowers rotted into grasping tendrils that reached hungrily toward the newborn before withering under the pure golden light radiating from both mother and child. "She's perfect," Elena whispered, cradling her daughter against her chest. The baby's eyes, when they fluttered open, were the deep green of old-growth forest flecked with gold that seemed to hold starlight. Tiny fingers grasped at the air, and where they moved, real flowers bloomed from the corrupted ground. True flowers, wild and imperfect and utterly alive. Morgane let out a shriek of rage that shattered the remaining illusions. The sacred grove collapsed around them, revealing a barren circle of dead earth surrounded by the very creatures Elena had fled. But something had changed. The shadow bear and flower woman no longer looked hungry. They looked afraid. "The child is unbound," one of them whispered in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "Free magic. Wild magic." "Impossible to claim," added another, backing away as Elena rose to her feet, still cradling her daughter. The baby's mere presence seemed to create a barrier of soft light that the creatures couldn't cross. Elena felt her own power settling into something entirely new, not the chaotic storm magic she'd struggled to control, but something steady and warm and utterly her own. Her daughter's birth had completed a circuit she hadn't known was incomplete, grounding her gifts in the most primal magic of all, a mother's love. "This isn't over," Morgane snarled, her beautiful form dissolving into mist and shadow. "The child will need training, protection, things only I can provide." "Then you shouldn't have tried to cage her," Elena replied calmly. Around them, the watching creatures began to melt back into the forest, recognizing something in Elena's voice that even they dared not challenge. "My daughter will grow up free to choose her own path, magical or mortal or something entirely new." The grove's illusions finished collapsing just as a roar of pure fury echoed through the trees. Ronan burst into the clearing, his massive form blazing with silver fire, ready to tear apart anything that threatened his family. But he stopped short when he saw Elena standing amid the ruins of Morgane's trap, whole and victorious, their daughter safe in her arms. Elena. Her name left his lips like a prayer of gratitude. "You did it. You broke free." "We did it," she corrected, stepping into his embrace as his arms enfolded both her and the baby. "I couldn't have found the strength without knowing someone believed I was worth fighting for." As they stood together in the pre-dawn darkness, Elena felt the mountain itself settling around them with something like approval. The immediate danger had passed, but she could sense this was far from over. Morgane's words about training and protection weren't entirely wrong. Her daughter would need guidance to navigate the magical inheritance flowing in her veins, but it would be guidance freely given and freely received, not bindings disguised as gifts. "What do we do now?" Elena asked, looking down at her daughter's perfect face. The baby's eyes tracked to the sound of her voice with an alertness that seemed far too wise for someone only minutes old. "Now we go home," Ronan said firmly. "I'll rebuild your cabin, stronger than before. We'll create a real sanctuary, one based on love, not magical contracts." Elena smiled, feeling pieces of her life rearranging themselves into patterns she'd never dared imagine. The frightened woman who'd hidden in an isolated cabin was gone. In her place stood someone who had looked ancient powers in the eye and chosen her own terms. Her daughter stirred in her arms, making a soft sound that might have been contentment. When Elena looked down, she could swear she saw approval in those impossibly knowing eyes. The real adventure was just beginning. The journey back to what remained of Elena's homestead felt like walking through a world reborn. Dawn was breaking over the Olympic Peninsula, painting the mist-shrouded peaks in shades of rose and gold that seemed to echo the warm light still radiating softly from her daughter's skin. Each step took them further from the nightmare of the false grove and closer to something Elena was finally ready to claim, a future built on her own terms. But as they emerged from the deepest part of the forest, the full scope of the previous night's destruction became impossible to ignore. Her cabin wasn't just damaged, it was utterly obliterated beneath the ancient cedar she'd accidentally felled. Decades of careful preparation, her grandmother's journals, the herbs she'd spent months gathering and drying for her daughter's arrival, all of it buried under tons of splintered wood that would take weeks to clear. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, cradling her baby closer as Ronan surveyed the wreckage with the methodical eye of someone who'd rebuilt from ruins before. "I destroyed everything you worked so hard to help me prepare." "You saved everything that mattered," he replied, turning to study her face with those ancient knowing eyes. "A building can be replaced. What happened in that grove?" He shook his head, silver fire still flickering at the edges of his aura. "Elena, do you understand what you did?" Morgaine has been binding magical children to her service for centuries. No one has ever broken free from her sacred grove through will alone. Elena felt her daughter stir against her chest, tiny fingers grasping at the morning air. Where those fingers pointed, she noticed, wildflowers were beginning to push through the debris, scattered earth with impossible speed. Her child wasn't just magically gifted, she was a force of pure creation, growing things with the same unconscious ease that she breathed. "She's going to need training," Elena said, the reality of her responsibilities settling over her like a mantle. Real training, not Morgaine's binding disguised as gifts. "But I don't know enough about the magical world to teach her properly." "Then we learn together," Ronan said simply, beginning to pull smaller pieces of wreckage away from what had been her front door. "The forest has other guardians, older ones who remember when magic flowed freely between worlds. They can teach us both." As if summoned by his words, Elena heard the soft sound of approaching footsteps. She tensed, power automatically rising to protect her daughter, but the figures that emerged from the tree line made her gasp in recognition instead of fear. Margaret Clearwater stepped into the clearing, her weathered hands carrying a bundle of what looked like baby clothes. Behind her came Tom Brightfeather, Elena's oldest friend among the local Quinault elders, his dark eyes taking in the destruction with calm acceptance. And following them, Elena's breath caught, came nearly a dozen people from town, each carrying supplies, tools, or food. "Heard there was some excitement up here last night," Margaret said dryly, her gaze moving between Elena, Ronan, and the baby with sharp intelligence. "Earthquake warnings on the radio, but those of us who know the old stories figured it might be something else entirely." "You came," Elena breathed, overwhelmed by the sight of her human community standing in the shadow of ancient magic, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Of course we came," Tom replied, setting down a toolbox and approaching slowly, his movements careful and respectful. "The mountain spirits have been restless for months, but they settled just before dawn. We felt the change." His eyes found Elena's daughter, and his weathered face softened. "She's beautiful, Elena, and powerful. I can feel it from here." Elena had spent so many years believing she had to choose between the magical and mundane worlds, between hiding her gifts or embracing isolation. But as she watched her neighbors begin clearing debris alongside the mysterious woodsman she loved, as Margaret cooed over her daughter with the same gentle authority she'd used to deliver half the babies in the county, Elena finally understood what her grandmother had been trying to tell her in those old stories. Magic wasn't meant to be separate from community, it was meant to serve it. "There's something you all need to know," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Last night wasn't just a magical awakening. There are forces that will want to claim my daughter, to use her power for their own purposes. Being here, helping us, it might put you in danger." Margaret snorted, a sound that somehow managed to be both dismissive and deeply affectionate. "Honey, we've been dealing with the strange and supernatural in these mountains since our grandparents' time. You think a little magical politics is going to scare us off?" Tom nodded gravely. "The old protections still hold, Elena. Blood and belonging, freely given and freely received. Your daughter will grow up knowing she has roots in both worlds." As if she understood the promise being made, Elena's daughter opened those impossibly wise forest eyes and looked directly at the gathered humans. For a moment, Elena could swear she saw approval in that ancient gaze, and perhaps, just perhaps, hope. The final confrontation with Morgaine was coming. Elena could feel it building like pressure before a storm, but now she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The pressure broke 3 days later. Elena was nursing her daughter in the temporary shelter Tom had helped Ronan construct when the forest went silent. Not the peaceful quiet of evening settling, but the absolute stillness that comes when every living thing holds its breath in terror. Even her baby stopped feeding, those ancient green eyes turning toward the tree line with an alertness that made Elena's blood freeze. "She's here," Ronan said quietly, emerging from the shadows where he'd been standing guard. Silver fire was already beginning to dance along his massive frame, but Elena could see the tension in his shoulders. Morgaine isn't coming alone this time. Through the mist that suddenly rolled in from nowhere, shapes began to materialize. Not the desperate creatures that had hunted Elena through the forest. These were beings of pure power, ancient spirits that predated human memory. They moved with the terrible grace of forces that had never learned to doubt their own authority, and at their center walked Morgaine herself, beautiful and terrible and absolutely furious. "You think your little community can protect what belongs to the wild?" Morgaine's voice carried across the clearing like wind through winter trees. "That mortal attachments can stand against obligations written in starlight?" Elena rose slowly, cradling her daughter against her chest as power began to flow through her veins. But this wasn't the chaotic storm magic she'd wielded before. 3 days of being constantly surrounded by love had taught her control. The energy that gathered around her now was focused, purposeful, and absolutely her own. "Nothing belongs to the wild," she replied, stepping out of the shelter to face the ancient spirit directly. "Everything chooses where it belongs." Around the clearing, her human neighbors emerged from the woods where they'd been working, carrying tools that suddenly seemed far more significant than simple construction equipment. Margaret held a staff carved with symbols that pulsed with soft light. Tom's hands blazed with the same silver fire that marked Ronan's heritage. Even the younger volunteers moved with the confidence of people who'd grown up knowing magic was real and dangerous and absolutely not to be feared. But it was her daughter's reaction that made Elena's heart sing with fierce pride. Instead of cowering from the assembled power of beings that could remake reality with a thought, the baby turned her face toward Morgaine and made a sound that was pure defiance, not a cry, but something closer to laughter. Where that joyful sound touched the air, flowers bloomed, not the twisted, hungry blossoms that had decorated Morgaine's false grove, but simple wildflowers that grew exactly as they pleased, rooted in honest earth and reaching for sunlight with perfect confidence. "Impossible," one of Morgaine's companions whispered. "The child is too young to manifest conscious magic." "She's not manifesting magic," Elena realized with sudden understanding. "She's manifesting choice, the freedom to grow wild and unbound." The revelation hit her like lightning for the second time in 3 days, but this understanding ran deeper than her moment of power in the grove. Her daughter wasn't just magically gifted, she was the living embodiment of something Morgaine had tried to destroy. The right to be magical and human, wild and rooted, powerful and loved, all at the same time. "You've taught her to reject her true nature," Morgaine snarled, taking a step forward that made the very ground tremble, "to choose limitation over limitless potential." "I've taught her that she gets to choose," Elena corrected, and felt every person in the clearing move to stand with her, not behind her, not as servants or protectors, but as equals who'd made the same choice to love something wild without trying to cage it. Ronan's massive hand found her shoulder, warm and steady, and utterly confident in her strength. "Tell us what you need," he said simply. Elena looked at the assembled forces arrayed against them, ancient spirits with power beyond mortal understanding, beings who'd shaped the world when humanity was barely a dream. Then she looked at her daughter, who was reaching tiny hands toward the flowers she'd grown, utterly fearless in the face of impossible odds. "I need exactly what I have," Elena said, and felt her power settle into something that made even Morgaine take an involuntary step backward. A family that chooses love over fear, growth over control, and freedom over safety. As the words left her lips, Elena finally understood what her grandmother's stories had been preparing her for. Not a single moment of magical triumph, but a lifetime of small choices to trust in love over power, community over isolation, hope over certainty. The final test wasn't about proving she was strong enough to face ancient magic. It was about proving she was brave enough to believe she deserved to win. Thunder rumbled overhead as storms, both literal and metaphorical, gathered in the morning sky. Elena smiled, cradling her daughter close, and prepared to fight for the right to be exactly who they chose to be. The first strike came as a wall of thorned vines erupting from the earth, reaching for Elena's daughter with hunger that transcended the physical. Elena's power blazed in response, golden light burning the grasping tendrils to ash before they could touch her child. But even as those threats withered, more emerged, shadows that moved independently of their sources, flowers that sang with voices designed to entrance and enslave, mist that whispered promises of power beyond imagining. "You cannot protect her from what she is," Morgaine called across the chaos of battle, her beautiful form shifting between woman and force of nature. "She is wild magic incarnate. She will destroy everything you claim to love unless she learns proper control." "She'll learn to choose," Elena replied, sidestepping a reaching shadow while her neighbors fought with weapons both mundane and mystical. Margaret's staff held back creatures made of starlight and malice. Tom's hands wove protections that turned Morgaine's attacks back on themselves. Even the youngest volunteers moved with deadly purpose, their tools becoming conduits for power that had been sleeping in these mountains for generations. But it was Ronan who truly terrified Morgaine's forces. The mysterious Woodsman had dropped all pretense of humanity, revealing himself as something that predated the spirits arrayed against them. Silver fire wreathed his massive form as he tore through ancient beings with the casual efficiency of wind reshaping stone. When one of Morgaine's companions tried to manifest as pure lightning, Ronan caught the bolt in his bare hands and crushed it like brittle glass. "You think this changes anything?" Morgaine shrieked, her control slipping as her supposedly invincible allies fell back in disarray. "I am bound to the source itself. I cannot be defeated by mortals playing with borrowed power." That's when Elena's daughter laughed again. The sound rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water, and where it touched the world, everything changed. Not the violent transformation Morgaine wielded, reshaping reality through force and will, but something far more profound. The baby's laughter didn't command the earth to bloom. It simply reminded the flowers that they had always been free to grow. The effect was devastating to Morgaine's forces. Creatures bound by ancient contracts suddenly remembered what it felt like to choose their own forms. Spirits that had served power for millennia looked around with eyes newly open to possibility. Even the shadows hesitated, no longer certain they wanted to devour light when they could dance with it instead. "No," Morgaine whispered, her perfect face contorting with something approaching panic. "This is not how the old laws work. Power requires sacrifice. Magic demands service. You cannot simply—" "Love freely given," Elena interrupted, understanding flooding through her as she watched her daughter's innocent joy reshape the fundamental rules of magical engagement. "That's what breaks every binding you've ever created, isn't it? Not strength, not cleverness, not even power, just the radical act of choosing to love without conditions." Around them, Morgaine's remaining allies were melting away, not destroyed, but transformed back into something they'd forgotten they could be. Free to serve love instead of power, growth instead of control, hope instead of certainty. But Morgaine herself wasn't finished. With a shriek of pure rage that shattered trees for 100 yards in every direction, she abandoned her beautiful form entirely and manifested as what she'd always truly been, the hunger that consumes wild things in the name of protecting them. A darkness that promised safety in exchange for freedom, power in return for choice. The shadow that had been Morgaine rose above the clearing like a living storm, reaching toward Elena's daughter with tendrils that could bind the child to servitude before she was old enough to resist. This was the moment Elena had been preparing for without knowing it. Not just her deepest fear, but the thing that made all fears possible. The belief that love wasn't strong enough to stand against forces that claimed to know better. Elena looked down at her daughter, whose forest-green eyes held starlight and ancient wisdom, and absolutely no doubt whatsoever that her mother would choose correctly. Then she looked at Ronan, whose silver fire burned steady and true with 800 years of patient hope. At Margaret and Tom and all the others who'd chosen to stand with her against impossible odds, simply because some things were worth defending. "You're right," Elena said to the darkness that had been Morgaine, cradling her daughter close as power beyond anything she'd ever imagined began to build around them. "Magic does demand service, but not to you." She lifted her free hand toward the storm overhead, toward the mountain that had sheltered her, toward the community that had claimed her, and spoke the words that would either save everything she loved or destroy it all. "I choose to serve joy." The world exploded into golden light. The golden light that erupted from Elena's declaration didn't just illuminate the clearing, it transformed it. But as the radiance reached its peak, Elena felt something tear deep inside her chest, a pulling sensation that made her gasp with sudden, devastating understanding. The power flowing through her wasn't borrowed or gifted, it was hers, drawn from the deepest wellspring of her being, and it was burning her humanity away like morning mist. "Elena!" Ronan's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she could see him reaching for her through the cascade of light. His silver fire was trying to shield her, to contain the forces she'd unleashed, but even his ancient strength couldn't touch what she'd become. She was transcending, becoming something that could stand equal to Morgaine's primal darkness. But transcendence, Elena realized with crystalline clarity, meant leaving everything mortal behind. The shadow storm that had been Morgaine writhed against the golden light, its tendrils dissolving wherever they met Elena's transformed radiance. "You don't understand what you're doing," the darkness shrieked, its voice fragmenting as ancient bindings shattered. "To wield source magic directly is to abandon your human form forever. You'll save your daughter but lose the ability to raise her." Elena felt her physical body beginning to dissolve, becoming pure intention and love made manifest. Her daughter was safe. She could feel that certainty singing in her bones, but the baby would grow up knowing her mother only as a whisper in the wind, a warmth in sunlight, a presence that could protect but never hold. Around the clearing, her chosen family was screaming her name. Margaret's weathered face was wet with tears as she reached toward the growing column of light. Tom's hands blazed with desperate power as he tried to weave some kind of anchor that could keep Elena tethered to the mortal world. Even the younger volunteers were pouring their strength into the effort, their tools glowing with shared determination to save the woman who'd taught them that magic could serve love instead of fear. But it was her daughter's response that broke Elena's heart completely. The baby wasn't crying or reaching for her dissolving mother. Instead, those ancient forest eyes held perfect understanding and absolute forgiveness. Her daughter knew exactly what Elena was sacrificing and why, and in that knowing, Elena glimpsed the terrible wisdom her child would carry, the knowledge that love sometimes demanded the ultimate price. "There has to be another way," Ronan's voice cut through the chaos, and Elena felt his massive presence pressing against the boundaries of her transformation. 800 years I've served as guardian, and I've learned every law that governs magic in these mountains. Source power requires a conduit, not a sacrifice. You don't have to burn yourself away." Through the golden haze of her dissolving humanity, Elena saw him clearly for the first time, not just the mysterious woodsman who'd chosen to love her, but something far older and more powerful. A being who'd given up his own transcendence long ago to serve as anchor between worlds. His silver fire wasn't just protective magic, it was the accumulated strength of centuries spent choosing mortal limitations over cosmic power. "The curse," she whispered, understanding flooding through her as pieces fell into place. "You've been bound to human form by choice, not punishment. You've been preparing for this moment for 8 centuries. Ronan's ancient eyes held infinite tenderness as he stepped directly into the column of light that was consuming her. Where his silver fire met her golden radiance, something new began to form, not the violent fusion of opposing forces, but a harmony that had been building across lifetimes. "I choose to serve joy," he said simply, echoing her words as his own immortal essence began to flow into the working she'd begun. "And joy is only real when it can be shared. The sensation of his magic joining hers was indescribable, like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. His centuries of patient hope merged with her fierce determination to protect, his ancient wisdom balanced by her mortal understanding of love's daily choices. Together, they became something neither could achieve alone, power that could reshape reality without abandoning the humanity that made such power worth wielding. The darkness that had been Morgaine gave one final shriek before dissolving entirely, its bindings shattered by the simple truth that love freely given was stronger than any force that demanded service. Around the clearing, her human neighbors cheered as the golden light settled into something warm and sustainable instead of devastating. But Elena felt the cost of their victory settling into her bones. She was still herself, still human, still able to hold her daughter and watch her grow. But the magic that had saved them all was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the bond she shared with Ronan, and that bond had transformed them both in ways that couldn't be undone. Looking into his eyes, Elena saw her own understanding reflected back. They had won everything they'd fought for, but victory had made them something new entirely, neither fully human nor completely wild, bound together by magic that would outlast their mortal forms. The price of saving her daughter was becoming something her daughter might eventually have to save in return. The golden light faded slowly, leaving the clearing transformed but recognizable. Where moments before ancient magic had torn reality apart, now wildflowers carpeted the earth in impossible profusion. Not the aggressive blooms that had marked Morgaine's presence, but gentle things that grew in harmony with the existing forest. The very air felt different, charged with possibility rather than threat. Elena sank to her knees, her daughter still cradled safely in her arms, and tried to understand what they'd become. Her body felt solid enough. She could feel the soft earth beneath her legs, smell the cedar and mountain air, hear her baby's contented breathing. But underneath the familiar sensations ran currents of power that had no name, connections that stretched beyond the clearing into every root and branch for miles around. "Are you hurt?" Margaret was the first to reach them, her weathered hands gentle as they checked Elena for injuries that wouldn't show as simple wounds. The older woman's eyes held new knowledge too. Whatever had happened here had awakened something in all of them, but none so dramatically as Elena and Ronan. "I don't think so," Elena replied honestly, though she wasn't certain what constituted injury anymore. Different, but not hurt. Ronan knelt beside them, his massive frame somehow even more solid than before, as if the magic that had nearly dissolved Elena had anchored him more firmly to the physical world. When their eyes met, she felt the bond between them pulse with shared understanding. They were still themselves, but those selves now encompassed something vast enough to span centuries. "The connection," he said quietly, his voice rough with wonder. "I can feel what you feel, know what you know. 800 years I've been alone with my memories, and now you're not," Elena finished, shifting her daughter so she could take his hand. The contact sent warmth spiraling through both of them, and around the clearing, flowers bloomed in response to their shared joy. Tom approached cautiously, his practical engineer's mind clearly struggling to process what he'd witnessed. The things that were here, Morgaine's forces, are they gone for good? Elena closed her eyes and let her awareness expand, following the new pathways of connection that spread through the forest like a vast network of light. Where before the mountains had held pockets of trapped power and ancient grievances, now she felt only the steady pulse of growing things choosing their own paths. "Gone," she confirmed. "Not destroyed, but transformed. Freed to become what they were before they forgot they had choices." Her daughter stirred in her arms, tiny hands reaching up to touch Elena's face, with the same fearless curiosity she'd shown throughout the battle. When those small fingers made contact, Elena gasped at the depth of awareness that flowed between them. Her child wasn't just magically gifted, she was a bridge between worlds, carrying both human love and wild power in perfect balance. "She's going to be extraordinary," Margaret observed, her own enhanced perception clearly picking up the same harmonious energies. But extraordinary in the way a river is extraordinary, powerful but natural, magical but grounded. Elena nodded, understanding more about her daughter's nature with each passing moment. The blood moon birth hadn't marked her child as cursed or chosen in the traditional sense. Instead, it had simply announced the arrival of someone capable of loving both the human and magical worlds without needing to choose between them. Around them, the volunteers were gathering with expressions of wonder and slight bewilderment. They'd come to help build a playground and found themselves witnesses to a battle for the very nature of magic itself. But instead of backing away from the impossible, they were adapting with the practical resilience that Elena had learned to love about her mountain community. "So what happens now?" asked one of the younger women, her tool belt still glowing faintly with residual power. "Do we finish the playground, or has everything changed too much for normal life?" Elena looked around the clearing, seeing it with eyes that could perceive both its mundane reality and its magical potential. The half-built playground equipment stood exactly where they'd left it, solid and practical and necessary. Children would still need safe places to play, even in a world where flowers could bloom at the sound of laughter. "We finish what we started," she said firmly. "Magic doesn't eliminate the need for swings and slides. If anything, it makes them more important." Ronan's hand tightened on hers, and she felt his agreement through their bond. They had gained power beyond imagining, but that power was meant to serve life, not replace it. Their daughter would grow up in a world where ancient curses could be broken by community action, where love freely given could reshape reality. But she would still need friends to play with and adults who understood that extraordinary children required both magic and mundane stability. "Then we build," Tom declared, his confidence returning as he focused on practical matters. "Though I suspect this is going to be the safest playground in Washington state." Elena smiled, feeling the truth of that prediction in her bones. Her daughter would indeed grow up surrounded by protection both magical and human, but more importantly, she would grow up understanding that power's purpose was to serve joy, and that the strongest magic was always love freely chosen. The immediate crisis was over. Now came the much more complex challenge of learning how to live with the consequences of victory. As autumn settled into its familiar rhythm, Elena found herself standing in her old garden behind the cabin, watching her daughter take her first wobbly steps between the raised beds of herbs. 6 months had passed since the battle in the clearing, and the world had grown surprisingly accustomed to its subtle new magic. The playground they'd built hummed with protective enchantments that looked like nothing more than excellent craftsmanship, and children played there safely while flowers bloomed in response to their laughter. But it was the sound of a familiar car engine climbing the mountain road that made Elena's breath catch. Through the bond she shared with Ronan, she felt his awareness sharpen from wherever he was working in the deeper woods. They'd both been expecting this moment, dreading and hoping for it in equal measure. Marcus stepped out of his expensive sedan looking exactly as polished and out of place as ever, his suit immaculate despite the dusty road. But Elena's enhanced perception caught what her purely human eyes had missed before, the careful control masking deep uncertainty, the way his gaze avoided the wild abundance of her garden as if afraid of what he might see. "Elena." His voice held none of its old condescension, replaced instead by something that might have been genuine humility. "You look, well." She studied him with eyes that could now see both surface and depth, noting how he'd changed in ways that had nothing to do with magic. The brittle confidence she remembered had worn thin, leaving behind someone who'd learned uncomfortable truths about the cost of choosing safety over authenticity. "Hello, Marcus." She made no move to approach, simply standing steady among her thriving plants while her daughter babbled happily at her feet. "This is unexpected." He glanced at the child, and Elena watched complex emotions flicker across his face. Recognition, regret, and something that might have been wonder. Their daughter had inherited Elena's dark hair but Ronan's startling eyes, and there was no mistaking her for anything but extraordinary. "She's beautiful," Marcus said quietly. "Nothing like I expected." "What did you expect?" A flush colored his cheeks. "I don't know. Something that would prove I was right to leave, maybe. Evidence that you'd chosen chaos over stability." He gestured helplessly at the garden, at Elena herself, at the contentment that radiated from everything he could see. "Instead, you've built something incredible." Elena felt Ronan before she saw him, his massive presence emerging from the tree line with the unhurried confidence of someone completely at home in his environment. Marcus tensed visibly at the sight of the giant woodsman, but held his ground with more courage than Elena had expected. "Ronan," Marcus nodded stiffly. "I suppose I should thank you for taking care of them." Ronan's ancient eyes assessed the smaller man with neither hostility nor welcome. "Elena takes care of herself. I simply chose to stand beside her." The distinction hung in the air between them, and Elena watched Marcus absorb it with visible discomfort. Through their bond, she felt Ronan's careful restraint, not the possessiveness she'd once associated with masculine protection, but the deep confidence of someone who trusted her to handle whatever came. "Why are you here, Marcus?" Elena asked gently, scooping up her daughter as the child reached for a butterfly that sparkled with faint enchantment. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disturbing it for perhaps the first time since she'd known him, to apologize, to try to understand what I threw away. His voice dropped, to see if there was any chance. "No." Elena's interruption was soft but absolute. "We were never right for each other, Marcus. You needed someone who would fit into your world, and I needed someone who could help me build a new one." She saw him flinch at the truth of it, but also watched him nod with reluctant acceptance. Whatever had brought him back up the mountain, it hadn't been real hope so much as the need to face what he'd lost. "The papers," he said after a moment, pulling official documents from his jacket. "The divorce finalization, and—" He hesitated, then produced a second set. "I'm signing over any claim to your property. The cabin, the land, it should have been yours outright from the beginning." Elena stared at him, recognizing the gesture for what it was. Not an attempt to buy forgiveness, but a genuine effort to undo what harm he could. The man she'd once thought she loved had finally learned something about accountability. "Thank you," she said simply, accepting the papers without drama. "That's generous." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, before Marcus cleared his throat. "I should go. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What I called wildness, it was really just you being authentic, and what I called stability was just fear dressed up as sophistication." As his car disappeared down the mountain road, Elena felt the last threads of her old life finally settling into place. She'd returned from their magical battle changed in every way that mattered, carrying power she was still learning to wield and love beyond anything she'd dreamed possible. But perhaps the greatest transformation was the simplest. She was finally completely home. Elena watched the dust settle from Marcus's departure, then turned back toward the cabin where her real life waited. The afternoon sun slanted through the ancient cedars, casting familiar patterns of light and shadow across the garden where ordinary herbs grew alongside plants that glowed faintly with their own inner radiance. This was her new normal. Magic and mundane intertwined so seamlessly that the extraordinary had become simply another aspect of home. "Mama!" Her daughter's delighted squeal drew Elena's attention to where the toddler had discovered a cluster of luminescent mushrooms growing near the porch steps. Tiny hands reached eagerly for the glowing fungi, and Elena felt no alarm. The forest's magic recognized its own, and her child was as safe among enchanted things as ordinary ones. "Gentle touches," Elena murmured, kneeling beside her daughter to demonstrate how to stroke the mushrooms without damaging their delicate structure. At their careful contact, the fungi pulsed with warmer light, as if pleased by the attention. Ronan emerged fully from the tree line, his massive frame moving with that peculiar grace that had first captured Elena's attention. Even now, months after their bonding, the sight of him still took her breath away, Not just his physical presence, but the deep contentment that radiated from him like warmth from a hearth fire. "The papers?" he asked simply, nodding toward the document she still held. "Freedom," Elena replied, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones, the last legal tie to a life that never really fit. Through their bond, she felt his quiet satisfaction. Ronan had never been jealous of her past with Marcus. His centuries of existence had taught him that love wasn't diminished by what came before, only strengthened by choosing what came after. But he understood the symbolic importance of this moment, the way closure with one chapter allowed complete investment in the next. Their daughter abandoned the mushrooms in favor of chasing a butterfly whose wings left trails of silver light in the air. Elena watched her run with fearless joy between magical and mundane wonders, equally delighted by both. This was what they'd fought for, not a world divided between human and wild, but one where a child could grow up understanding that love came in many forms, all equally real. Margaret called earlier, Ronan mentioned, settling beside Elena on the porch steps with the careful precision of someone whose size required constant awareness. "The Autumn Festival Planning Committee wants to know if we'll help with the children's activities again." Elena smiled, remembering last month's harvest celebration where her daughter had accidentally caused an entire field of pumpkins to bloom out of season, much to the delight of the local families. The mountain community had adapted to their resident magic workers with typical practicality, treating Elena's abilities as simply another useful skill, like Tom's engineering expertise or Margaret's herb knowledge. "Of course," Elena said, "though we might want to warn them about the possibility of spontaneous flower displays." "The children love the flower displays," Ronan pointed out, and Elena felt his amusement through their connection. "Last week, young Tommy Peterson asked if I could make the playground roses bloom year-round. Can you? Probably. Should I?" Elena considered this seriously. The question captured everything about their new existence, power that could reshape reality, balanced by the responsibility to use it wisely. Magic for its own sake was the trap that had snared beings like Morgaine. Magic in service of joy, however, was something else entirely. Ask his mother first, she decided, and maybe start with just the climbing rows by the swings. See how the ecosystem adjusts. Ronan nodded, understanding her caution. They'd learned to approach their abilities like gardeners rather than gods, nurturing growth, guiding development, but always respecting the natural patterns they worked within. Their power was vast, but it flourished best when used gently. As evening approached, Elena gathered her daughter and headed inside to begin their familiar routine of dinner, bath, and bedtime stories. But now those stories included tales of brave woodsmen and wise herbalists, of communities that chose love over fear, of magic that served rather than conquered. Her daughter listened with rapt attention, those ancient forest eyes holding understanding that went deeper than her few spoken words could express. Later, after the child was safely asleep, Elena and Ronan sat together on their porch, watching stars emerge over the mountain peaks. The bond between them hummed with quiet contentment, carrying shared memories of the day and gentle anticipation of tomorrow's possibilities. "Do you ever miss it?" Elena asked softly. "The simplicity of before?" Ronan considered her question with the careful thought he brought to all things that mattered. "I miss the illusion that love was simple," he said finally, "but I wouldn't trade the reality of love that's complex for anything we've lost." Elena leaned against his solid warmth, feeling truth in his words. Their love encompassed more than romance. It held community responsibility, magical stewardship, the daily choice to build something lasting. It was harder than the simple passion she'd once thought she wanted with Marcus, and infinitely more rewarding. Around them, the forest settled into its nocturnal rhythms, and Elena finally understood what home truly meant. Not a place where nothing changed, but one where change served growth, where magic existed to nurture rather than dominate, where love was measured not in promises, but in presence. She was exactly where she belonged.